We're spring 23, so we have a good group throughout the semester. Hopefully you've seen some of the emails highlighting who we have today. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Knickknick rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. So we feel as planners, obviously, it's important to create more equitable communities, and we share some resources with you to deepen your knowledge. I'm also excited that this year's Cause Your lecture on April 20th will be Bill Quackenbush from the Ho-Chunk Nations, and he's going to share their perspective of planning principles and lessons for practitioners across the state to take from that. So I'm excited today that we are kicking off the semester with Errin Welty from Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. So many of you may be familiar with Erin's work. Maybe you meet with her in your communities. She's going to be talking about vacant to productive, talking about project examples and some of the resources that the state may have for you in your community. I ask that you place some of your questions or comments in the chat. And if appropriate, I will interrupt Errin and ask her the question. We'll have about 10 minutes probably at the end for open discussion and comments as well. And just at the end, there'll be another survey. Give us your ideas for future speakers and any comments you have. So welcome, Errin.
Thanks. I am thrilled to be here, and it's nice to see a few familiar names in the chat or in the attendees. These are I combined two of my favorite presentation topics and kind of doubled down on the geeky planning speak because I figured I had a friendly audience who spoke planner and I didn't have to make it elected official friendly. So I included some best practices, worst practices from some of our communities, and I don't see anybody on here that represents a worst practice, so I hopefully will not offend anyone, but I'm sure if you see your community on here, it will come as no surprise to you. But I did want to start by talking about why downtown. A big part of my work is obviously convincing folks that investing in downtown is useful and relevant and a good economic investment. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes a vibrant downtown, and then how communities, municipalities, planners can stifle or support vibrancy. And then I have a bunch of case studies and resources and examples to kind of inspire and spur discussion. So before we get too far, why downtowns? It's been great working in the downtown realm recently because downtowns are all of a sudden very sexy and people want to invest. But we've always been advocates for investing. We track the economic market share of our downtown districts for the communities that we work in. And on average, those downtown areas represent 2% of the geographic land mass of a community, but have an average of 6% of assessed values, which is huge when you consider that all of the libraries, courthouses, jails, city halls, our churches are located in those parts of the communities. And a huge chunk, as much as 15, 20, 30% of hotel rooms, businesses, restaurant spending, retail spending, and increasingly residential units are located in the heart of the community. So improving, one small block of property taxable value in a downtown has really ripple-on effects economically in terms of sales tax, property tax, and just overall activity. I mentioned residential development has been a really big push. I don't think we work with a single community in the state that does not have a shortage of residential units. But we know that downtowns are someplace where those units can go and people are less concerned about density or development. And also when you put those residential units within walking distance of shops and businesses, they are 200% more likely to spend money at those local shops and businesses, which if you think of your own lifestyle, obviously if you say work above a coffee shop, you're going to go there at least twice as much, probably more often than if you have to get in the car and drive across town to that same coffee shop. So by putting these residential units within a walkable distance of downtown, we're really doubling down on the ability to support those retailers or restaurants that everyone says that they are looking for. We're also talking today about vacant buildings, and occasionally we'll hear primarily from elected officials, well, it's their right to keep their building vacant and they're only hurting themselves. They're suffering, they're paying the taxes, so it's not our problem if it's vacant. But what our research shows that it really does matter. The community generally loses an average of about $76,000 in economic activity for every year the building just sits vacant. And this is for a regular building with maybe 2 apartments upstairs and a storefront downstairs. There's all that ripple on effect in terms of spending and worker spending and utilities and business to business spending that's not taking place. And that doesn't even factor in the impact on adjacent properties from the lack of foot traffic and reduced kind of overall activity. We know also that buildings that are chronically vacant are usually valued at about half that of an actual occupied building. So it doesn't even need, that occupied building does not need to be fully renovated and completely gentrified. Just being occupied really makes it that much more valuable to a community. So I work within the Main Street program in Wisconsin and with the National Main Street Center. And the Main Street program is based on the 4-point model, which really just says that downtown development is a holistic practice, that we can't just slap new awnings and facades on properties and have them look pretty and say we're done, that we've transformed our downtown. By the same token, we can't support entrepreneurs and businesses but not give them a streetscape and public space that's conducive to people lingering, people gathering, people wanting to spend time in that community. So bringing together the civic, the physical, the economic, and the social kind of marketing and connections is really where downtowns start to thrive. So we all have a role to play in making that happen. And both businesses, private investors, municipalities, and our nonprofits and civic organizations all have a role to play, which we will talk about resources for each of those. But as we're talking about places and spaces, all of us exist in a space, but not all of our communities have those places that are meaningful and relevant in our communities. And a lot of what we do as planners, as architects, we think about individual buildings and individual contexts, but really people experience places in connections, right? You see a vista, you see a view, you have an experience that goes beyond just one specific place. People are coming downtown and going to just one business and leaving, then we've really missed the mark in terms of creating a downtown that's a vibrant place that people want to come back to. I always tell people that, nobody has ever made a memory in a strip mall. Our job for downtowns is to create places where people make memories. Another test that I have for our communities to say, if you are a vibrant community, if you have a great sense of place, if you have a place where people will take wedding pictures and graduation pictures, that's a good sign. If you don't have any of those places in your downtown, then you've missed the mark somewhere. And we have a lot of examples, mostly of engineers, apologies to any of you who are engineers, of building things that are not places. They are well-intentioned and they, have the elements of a place, but maybe they are not built to enhance the user experience. They're built to be functional intellectually, but not in practice. So we're talking about sidewalks that are not where people want to be. There's any number of examples of benches where no one would ever want to sit. If you're sitting on that bench in the middle right, I don't think anyone has ever wanted to look at a parked car while they're sitting and eating their lunch. So our cities are rife with this. I'm sure every single one of you could find somewhere in your community a bench that no one has ever sat on in their life. So we're focused on making places that all work together. Probably the second most popular question I get asked behind where can I get money, which we will talk about later today, is what do I do with the problem property that I have in my community? I have a vacant building and I don't know what to do with it. The one caveat that I usually give folks starting off this conversation is that every vacancy has a story. No property owner has ever started out wanting to be a slumlord in their life. It is not a goal that they have. And so we really have to understand what the story behind the vacancy is and understand that it's not necessarily logical and that the solution is not also going to be necessarily logical or economics based. So there are certainly some numbers and economic factors that contribute to vacant spaces. So spaces that are too big for current uses, we're talking, giant old department stores. Obviously, that's a huge lift. Maybe spaces that were zoned for something that they're completely inappropriate for now. Obviously, that takes a lot more in terms of utilization and know-how to turn that around. Maybe the zoning is not accurate. You have to get it rezoned and the politics are not friendly to that. Sometimes buildings are assessed at rates that are untenable, or the mortgage holder is underwater, and maybe it's not a local bank that's willing to work with you. And then lastly, and probably most often misunderstood, is how much income is the property generating. So this building that's up here, I think we would all agree it is not supporting the downtown. It is not a complementary building that is driving a sense of vibrancy and vitality. That said, this building was actually home to, I think they had, it was used for storage, and I think they had leases with 4 different companies who were all storing things in that building at $500 a month. So that building is bringing in $2,000 every month in rental income. It's obviously, owned free and clear. They're not paying a lot in upgrades. So that building is generating a huge amount of net cash for the owner that if you want to buy it from them, you're going to have to replace that income, which is really hard for lots of people to understand. And then equally important, lots of our vacancies are driven by feelings. The property owner inherited the property from their grandmother and it's all they had left of them, or it's where they ran their business for 50 years and they don't really want to acknowledge that they're never going to run a business again because that's their identity and who they are. So in those cases, it's really thinking about who are their connections in the community? Do they have adult children that might be able to negotiate for us? Are they concerned about legacy? What if we open a storefront that is named after them, or they can be a mentor to a program or a entrepreneur that's moving into the space? So connecting those feels can be equally important. And then there's a lot of other issues, some of which are regulatory, which we'll talk about. I have 4 case studies of communities that have actually pretty much ensured that buildings will remain vacant because of policies. And then we have brownfields, which again, municipalities can have a role in helping unravel, but not all are willing to. Poor landlords, you cannot have a business recruitment program if you don't have quality landlords. Sometimes it does take, overpaying for properties to get them out of the hands of people who are owning them. And sometimes it's the market. We all have been in communities that just have a much larger downtown historically than their current economy supports. So within all of those buckets of causes, there's a lot of approaches that can be taken depending on how much money or political capital, social capital you're willing to spend. This is kind of just a spectrum of opportunities, and any combination of these is important. But it's also important to recognize that this is going to be a very long-term project. So if you can identify some of these low-cost, low advocacy political capital things, they can make things happen in the short term so people can see visible signs of results. Because the one thing that we hear all the time from the communities is, man, our downtown is never going to be successful because we just have those buildings and they're always going to look like that. And it's really easy to believe that it always will look like that. So doing anything that shows progress and change can do a lot to change mindsets. I don't think I have it in this presentation, but there's an example of a gas station in Gordon. And it was one of those all metal gas stations, and it was closed, had been abandoned for 20 years. And all the community said, it's waste, let's tear it down, it's never going to be anything. And there was an individual who fell in love with it. And he was passionate about that kind of Americana architecture. He painted it. And once he painted it and it looked new and fresh and people saw that it could look different, then everybody wanted to contribute to the Kickstarter and the GoFundMe to make that building happen. So sometimes changing how things look and people see things in a different way is a good first step. But as I mentioned, everybody does have a role in kind of unwinding some of this stuff. So whether it's creating funding pots, because 2/3 of the projects that we work on in our department require public assistance. There's no way that you're going to inherit a building with 50 years worth of deferred maintenance and not have some sort of public assistance to make that project feasible if you're really going to undo some of these circumstances. You're surveying building owners to figure out what they actually need instead of just making assumptions, again, is important. Entrepreneurs, business owners, property owners have to be willing to invest. So having the public spaces that support that, which we have a case study for, but any variety of civic and public and private investors can make a difference if they're working together. I mentioned that most of the projects we work on have public assistance. It used to be that everybody had a revolving loan fund or a facade grant, and it would fund, awnings and signage, and that was about it. But what we realized is that not every property needs an awning, and sometimes what they need is a roof. And helping them put an awning on when their roof is failing is not necessarily the right strategic move. So there's a lot of new models of revolving loan funds that are out there, whether it's the white box program that Racine had that really helped people move into kind of outdated spaces that had your nice wood paneling and shag carpeting and mirrors on the walls, some engineering, architecture, design, feasibility studies that some of our communities have done, curb appeal, funds for ADA and restrooms, kitchens in communities that are really lacking in restaurants. Some of those major capital improvements that help make your businesses more welcoming and or legal can be important. And those improvements stay with the property. So even if one restaurant fails, which certainly is the case because it's really easy to fail at running a restaurant, the next person will have a leg up and be much more likely to succeed because those amenities already exist. We did a study a couple of years ago, probably like 5 years ago now, that looked at the economic impact to businesses from occupying in storefronts that were renovated. Because we don't want to just tell property owners that, we're from the government, we're here to tell you what your property can look like. But we had some really compelling case studies that showed that there was an actual economic benefit to being a tenant, whether a retail store or a professional service business, in a property that was improved. So 90% of the buildings that were improved, the business had increased foot traffic, and 80% of the businesses had increased sales. So that was a huge way to demonstrate that it is a cost-effective strategy for businesses themselves. So you can see one example here of both a retailer and a real estate agent that made those improvements and had an economic benefit as a result. The other thing that we hear from property owners all the time is that they don't make an investment in their property because they're afraid. Or they're either afraid of what they might find. If they talk to the building inspector, he might tell them something, he or she might tell them something that they don't want to hear, or they just don't know, right? They don't speak building code, they don't speak awning, they don't speak lighting. They are really good at running a shoe store and don't know anything else about property maintenance, nor should they. So providing some of those guides and tools to help property owners understand what resources are available. Maybe it's volunteer labor to do some quick touch-ups, especially if you have elderly owners in your community that maybe don't have the physical ability to make that happen. Partnerships with artists to do merchandising in the windows. If you run a hardware store, you're not necessarily an artist. Do you want your storefront to look bad? No, but that's not really your area of expertise. But partnering them with an artist who can make a Christmas tree out of snow shovels could really benefit everybody in the community. But they're not going to seek out those partnerships on their own. So helping foster those partnerships so that everybody benefits can be a great strategy. So regulatory tools. I have talked to a lot of mostly elected officials again, who would really like to crack down on the vacant buildings, crack down on the blight in their communities, and they really want to jump straight to eminent domain or demolition by neglect or fining people with building code violations. And I had to counsel a lot of them out of that strategy for a couple of reasons. One, in some communities, the municipal properties are equal offenders to some of the private properties, in which case your lawyer is not going to be very happy with you. Two, if you don't have design guidelines that are pretty well set and well implemented, it is equally likely that if you push that property owner and threaten them with, fines or fees, they could just tear that building down, or they could take the windows out altogether and put in glass block. And if your design guidelines do not prevent that, you might be creating a bigger issue than you currently have. And that's something that not everybody wants to assume that it will work, that people will just be so tired of dealing with fines that they'll sell, but that rarely actually happens. If they're holding on to that building out of spite, that spite is not going away. But we have seen some best practices in this arena, combining carrots and incentives with the threat of sticks. So if you really want to have the threat of enforcement, tying it to enhanced grant program or a targeted investment program to help them make those changes, especially if it's limited time only, capitalizing on that fear of missing out, can be very effective. Using your inspector to write down observations about the property and what they observe can be one strategy. And then coupled with, a robust loan and grant program to help make that happen. And then lastly, on the district side, all of these issues have been things that really have precluded investment in certain properties that we've worked with. So parking requirements that require a change of use to provide designated spaces in a downtown is almost always detrimental when you have lot line to lot line buildings. Sprinklers have been huge. There's a number of communities that suggest or that consider a property vacant and a change of use if it's been vacant for 6 months or more, and that has definitely killed a number of projects. Sprinklers are ridiculously expensive, especially if you have to run laterals. Structural limitations. Some of our buildings are so deep that they will never be commercial for the entire first floor. So rear residential can be a solution, but not every city is willing to consider that. And then just some other information about, what's relevant for your district. The second piece to the vacancy puzzle, obviously you have the property owner who has to be on board to make sure things that are able to happen, but somebody has to be willing to go into that space. So if the property owner is not going to run a business, how can we make it so that it's a great place for a private entity to move in and find a home in our communities? Many communities, purport to want entrepreneurs. They want those locally supported businesses, local investment. Obviously, we know that a far greater share of profits from local businesses return to the community in the form of spending or baseball team sponsorships or really anything else. It's also some place that defines your local character. Again, nobody, goes shopping in a community unless you're Schaumburg because you only have chain stores. Most people are looking for something different. And it's the biggest number one way of growing local jobs. So it is something that's worth pursuing, but it is not for the faint of heart. So what matters to small businesses? How do communities become small business friendly? They are looking for predictability, transparency, to some extent, low costs, the ability to stand out in a community, and the supportive network. When we do surveys of businesses in our communities, the number one reason that they located in a downtown is because there's a supportive network of other entrepreneurs. So it is something that definitely can be leveraged, and having that existing network is something that can be built upon. We did, however, do a business permitting study. So we pretended that we were opening a 2,000 square foot retail space in, I think, 20 of our communities at the end. This says 10, but we expanded it the next year of mid-sized communities. And we found that the fee for permitting that business, assuming we were making fairly minimal improvements, adding a signage and awning, tweaking a few things related to the bathroom, but not really doing any significant build out. But the permitting fee for that same 2,000 square foot space ranged from $95 to $1,500, depending on the community that we were looking at. And these were all mid-sized communities, so it's not communities of 1,000 and 100,000. But the variation was huge. And then looking at how many committees or boards they needed to go in front of to get those permits, or what the time to agendas was, ranged from 2 weeks to 4 months, again, for similar sized communities. If you're a new business and the average amount of startup capital you have is $5,000, that's a huge, I mean, if you're paying $1,500 for permitting fees and you're not aware of that up front, that's a huge detriment to being able to open. And similarly, if you're paying rent for 4 months before you're able to open, and you're not aware and build that into your business plan, it's going to be a significant detriment to your long-term success. We did also interview folks who opened in these communities, and those businesses who were able to work with a mentor or work with a liaison at the city were twice as likely to have a good experience and report that they would open again. Those people who did not have anybody that they worked directly with, more than 75% of them reported having difficulty getting their information approved, getting conflicting messages, missing a step because they didn't know what they needed to do. So having that in writing, obviously it's, yes, scale at 4 months is nuts, and $1,500 is probably more than we want people to spend. But if they know up front, at least they can plan for it. And that's something that we definitely found was not the case. When we did those interviews, some of the common limitations that folks indicated that they had, restrictive signage was the number one. That's actually something our team is currently working on. We're developing a guideline for proposed signage. We one of the programs that we do within Main Street communities every year is a makeover. So we actually go into a business and help make them over, which has been very illustrative from our team, because we tell people what to do a lot, or what they should be doing. And it's one thing to suggest what people should be doing. It's another thing to have an argument with a sign guy because he has a sale on, PVC, and that's not what we wanted them to have. So it's been very informative, but we're actually working on a makeover right now where this local sign ordinance, I think, prescribes 10 square feet of signs total. And the building that we're working on is a corner building with lots of windows, and within that 10 square feet, we could have essentially one projecting sign and a vinyl sign on the door, which is completely insufficient for the size that this property is and the location that they're in. So, it was a well-intentioned design guideline. Nobody wants there to be too many signs or signs on every window, but it's really limiting our ability to draw people into that business. So we're learning a lot through things like that in terms of what it's actually like to work with within these sign guidelines. But signage is one of the critical ones that we're working on because 76% of customers go into a new business based only on the signs. That sign is if you have the projecting sign, the vinyl sign, and the flush mount sign, that is how different audiences of visitors find you. So if you're a car, you're going to see one sign. If you're walking down the sidewalk, you're going to see a projecting sign. If you're standing in front of the business, you'll see the vinyl sign. But any one of those that's missing is going to limit your audience by a third. So having that ability to meet all of those audiences within a downtown is critical. I know the DOT and projecting signs are a whole other thing. And I wish I could work on that, but that is something that we've, number one, found that municipalities have the ability to really help businesses be able to meet those marketing needs. Kind of the second thing that we've been working on over the last couple of years is outdoor activities. So we're talking about parklets and patios and outdoor merchandising. There's a lot of studies that show that if you have a parklet or an outdoor patio, your restaurant returns are significantly higher. People are much more willing to hang out in a patio space and wait for service, which is especially relevant today's lack of kind of workers. Also, people buy more drinks when they sit outside, which is directly benefiting those that 65% restaurant spending. But even bookstores, hair salons, antique shops, other folks that have outdoor merchandising or outdoor benches can still see significant returns. It makes you look like a viable business. It draws attention, helps you stand out from the crowd. So it's something that many of our communities have adopted. I would say that 50% of the communities that we work with allow parklets and outdoor merchandising and are trying to convince their businesses to get on board. And the other 50% are still really skeptical. One community that has college that shall not be named was 100% certain that there would be willy-nilly people passing beer over the, patio onto the sidewalk, and there would be mass drunkenness if there was outdoor dining. They did grant a 1-month trial period for a business, and it turns out it did not dramatically result in wanton drunkenness in downtown. But sometimes it does take that little like, okay, we're going to test this. Let's do a pilot. We were working with the DOT to relook at opening up patios on downtown streets that were highways, which they did during COVID, and we thought we were making progress. And then there was that driver that drove through the one on KK. So that was a non-starter, but perhaps we'll revisit it again at some point. So some things that communities can do to be business friendly. We have a couple communities that have these business and property owner guides that talk about who you can call. So if you need trash service, if there's a street light that's out, if there's graffiti, if there's a pothole, like who's in charge of all these things, right? Like most of you, average citizens have no idea. So it's a great way to give new businesses and property owners a guide to who they should be calling, so they're not always calling the chamber or the city or whomever. And then we've been really trying to work with our communities to create user-friendly design guidelines, because most businesses and property owners do not know how to read about zoning and massing. And usually, if you want to put a new sign on a building, you have to read through 6 pages of zoning on conditional uses and, square footage and transparency minimums. And it's just a lot of math for some people. So we did create these Word documents that you see at the bottom, where there's 1 page for awnings. There's 1 page for signage. There's 1 page for upper story windows. And so they have pictures. So again, property owners do not want to be slumlords. They don't want to put up ugly awnings, but awning guys are really persuasive about their, things that they have on sale this month. It could be really hard to explain to them what you're looking for. So we tried really hard to make these design guideline templates to have good and bad pictures, like do this, not this, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So when you see on here all these places with green, that's where a community could ideally just put in their specific height, weight, or height, massing, transparency guidelines, and hopefully the rest of it is generic enough that it applies to almost anyone with a good design guideline system. Obviously it's editable, but then you could just give this 1 page to somebody who wanted to update a sign instead of referring to them to section 68.12 of your zoning code, kind of thing. So then last but not least, public spaces. This is something that I'm really excited about because, as probably all of you know, WEDC launched a Vibrant Spaces grant program this fall/winter, and we sent out more than 100 applications for the program, and we have, last I checked, between 60 or 70 that came back, and so we're actually going to be reviewing those in the next couple of months. But this is really where that transformative opportunity exists to have the public spaces complement the businesses and property owner investment and spur additional investment. We all have this continuum of engagement, I think, summarizes the public input process pretty succinctly. There's always going to be those people on the far left that are hostile and angry to anything and everything. And there's some people who just love your city and they're going to do whatever to make that happen. But there's a whole lot of people in the middle that just don't think about that, right? They go to their house, they go to their favorite store, but all it takes is one new initiative, one public art project, and they might move from neutral to curious. And if they're curious, they might, volunteer for the next mural because they think that was really cool. And then they might serve on a committee. So a big part of, most of what my job is to help communities move people along the spectrum. Because if we want workers to be recruited and retained, and we want our citizenry to be engaged and sit on committees, we have to move them from neutral to at least curious or engaged to make that happen. And one way to do that is creating a sense of place that gets people out, gets people connected to their community and meeting with each other. Really, no one is deciding if they're going to go out tonight in, you know, Shorewood or West Bend. They're deciding if they're going to sit on their couch and watch Netflix or if they're going to go out to dinner. So creating districts that provide connections and entertainment and people watching can make that choice a little easier. So there's all kind, and placemaking is kind of the blanket term, but really it's just creating places where people want to be, a place where you might discover something new or see something cool or engage with a space in a way that is unexpected. Things that are temporary, things that make you smile, that are unexpected. It's pretty easy to incorporate these into public spaces, but it just takes a little bit of effort and know-how. As much as 50% of shopping decisions are influenced by merchandising, your public spaces, your placemaking is your merchandising. So having those spaces that are memorable, that make you want to come back are critical. So understanding how easy it is to do some of these things, so that you have these pictures on the bottom of, you know, open flags or benches or plants or merchandising. Lots of communities, these things would be illegal, or some of these things, but yet I think we would all agree that these are amazing places and that, you know, create a sense of place. So figuring out how we can accommodate stuff like this without obviously, you know, blocking the sidewalk or doing other things that are going to deter actual commerce. So there's some examples of things that communities that we've worked with have done. Some of you are probably on this call. Some of the SOUP programs that support our urban projects, where citizens can pitch improvements that they'd like to see, whether that's creative crosswalks, again, not with a DOT, I know, or this is one where we did a placemaking activity in Viroqua. We brought in a placemaking firm and we built a parklet and we added some flags. I think this is the mayor actually demonstrating how to use them. We added some crosswalks, some temporary furniture. You know, what can we test again to see what works? It doesn't have to be permanent. We're just seeing what works. This is Eagle River. They have a new plaza that they're developing. So there's AstroTurf that was put down so we could test different things. This is a vinyl mural that just went up to see how people would use it and respond to it. And then we had some interactive activities where folks could vote on what they wanted to see in the space. But testing it out is a good strategy. So before I get to some case studies, I did have some resources. So historic tax credits, many of you I'm sure know about. I am putting together a guide to small projects that have used historic tax credits, because things like, you know, the Hotel Northland or Titletown or projects in Milwaukee, Pabst Brewing are amazing, but they don't really give a lot of credibility to our small properties that might want to access these tools. So I'm putting together a case study of the building in Osceola, Bitch and Bob's Barbecue in Dodgeville, some of these other smaller projects that could be examples and learning stories for people. We have our CDI grants, obviously, which is 25% of downtown rehab projects. Tons of great examples. I'm happy to share that if any of you have not heard of that program. I have a whole case study of great breweries and hotels and mixed use buildings and gas station rehabs, adaptive reuse that we funded through that. PACE funding, I think, is in almost every community in Wisconsin. Can be great if you're owner occupied for the long haul and are looking for something. Kiva, we do have 0% crowd lending. So this is a tool that's available to everybody across the state. We've funded, trying to think, WIBIC runs one matching program. We will match businesses that are in our downtown districts, but we've WEDC has matched 30 in the last couple of years. It's a great program for businesses looking to invest and expand. The Vibrant Spaces grant I just mentioned, which the deadline just passed, but hopefully based on the demand, we will be bringing that back. Some of the small dollar big impact grants can be funded for placemaking. I think the realtor grants in Wisconsin have all gone to Kenosha or Pleasant Prairie, but if your realtors want to get aggressive and apply for that, that's out there. But then I had some final stories. So some of you may recognize these properties. This, I'm not gonna tell you where they are, except for this one, I guess says. So the one on the left is owned by a couple, it's been vacant for the last 25 years. It's owned by a couple who really wants to restore it, and they have a background that would, it's an old opera house, and it's, you know, a good fit for them, but they no longer live in the community. They had to move away for employment reasons, but they don't want to give up on their dream, even though they are no longer young enough to rehab the building by themselves. But back in the day, probably 20 years ago, they had proposed something to the municipality that they wanted to do. And because the municipality did not like them at the time, it's small town politics, right? They were turned down and kind of retaliated against. There was actually a lawsuit that the municipality lost. And as a result, the owners hold a grudge and will continue to hold a grudge forevermore. So the only way that that property is going to change hands is if their adult children or friends in the community can persuade them to sell. And it has been a challenge for years. But as an example of, you know, going in too strong can result in multi-decade non-activity. The creamery that you see here is built like a tank, is in a small town. There was a use that was going to use part of the building and actually had started looking at renovations. And then it was discovered that to use any single part of the building was going to be considered a change of use and would therefore require sprinkling the whole building, which would cost upwards of $150,000, which the building was not worth. So the building is still vacant because there's no way, given what had been done to change it, to get out of that particular zoning law. This building on the left suffered a fire 25 years ago. Building owner walked away because the insurance was not sufficient to take care of renovations that would be necessary. There is a standing offer to purchase the building from the property owner next door who would like to expand into the property. And they're essentially the only ones that could do so because it would need all new utilities. But the county is not willing to help take the property for back taxes and sell it to the owner. I don't know why, because the county board is the way they are. So it continues to sit. And then this other one is an example of that parking issue I talked about. There are tenants in this whole building, but there could be many more tenants if they could build out some of the extra apartments in the upstairs space. But doing so would require providing dedicated parking spaces. And the building is lot line to lot line or zero lot line basis. And that is not an option because there's no other spaces on the block without tearing a building down. So that building sits. On the positive side of things, we have the Oxbow Hotel, which is in Eau Claire. Obvious success story, but I did want to share this because this property, obviously the picture I have here is fairly dated, but it didn't get a lot better in the interim years between the motel and, you know, when the current renovation took place. But you can see that the public amenities were not really conducive to people wanting to walk from downtown to this area. So a big part of what this funding structure did from the city side is provide some of the public amenities and the streetscaping, $343,000 specifically to make that space, the city amenities up to snuff so that somebody was going to invest this level, $4 million in private investments. So it's something where if the city had not been able to make that connection and make that, their spaces, the public spaces, match the level of the private investment, it was really going to detract from the overall project. And I see the sprinkler question. That's a whole other conversation, but we can talk about that. So really what we were hoping to do with the Vibrant Space grant is to look at those spaces that are in our communities that are perhaps underutilized. We have a lot of spaces that don't get used. They were built for something specific. Maybe there was a parking lot or a parking garage that was built for a tenant that no longer exists. But what can we do to transform spaces from not meeting any goals of our district to being somewhere that people wants to stay? I always use this example from the Better Block project, which I'm sure all of you have seen. But we have so many places that look like the upper left, right? There's businesses that are in those spaces, but everyone assumes, well, no one really wants to be there. There's no customers in this area. Those businesses, why would they be open on a weekend? There's no one around. But when you put in that public space amenity and you make it look like a place people want to go, then all of a sudden, there are plenty of people that are always willing to spend time in great spaces. But it's our job to help make those spaces places that private investors want to invest, that customers want to visit. And then I put in one parting moment of inspiration. So this is in Whitewater, and I will mention it because it's a good story. So this White Elephant building, literally called the White Elephant building, when we started working with Whitewater in the Main Street program in the early 90s, this was written into their Main Street application as a major challenge that was facing their district. In 2007, Joe on our team drew this rendering of what possibly the building might be. And it was not until this year that Whitewater got a community development investment grant from us, and a property owner is now taking on that property. So it took multiple decades, but it will finally go from being a white elephant to being a productive member of the community. But if if they had pursued demolition by neglect or some of these other things, probably it would be a parking lot. But because they waited and were patient and worked on other things in the district, a property owner came along that said, you know what, I'm willing to make this investment and make this property what it could be. And now it will be. So sprinkler requirements. It is set by state building code, but it's up into interpretation. So we have some communities that have said, so part of it is change of use, and there's some interpretation of what change of use can be. So we have a couple of communities that have said if a property is vacant for 6 months, any new use is a change of use, not automatically triggers sprinklers. There have been a couple communities in Iowa that have done easements and have done building wide sprinklers where they ran a single lateral and then sprinkled the whole block, which they used TIF dollars to do that, which was amazing because we all know that if Carolyn, I can see Carolyn, so I can pick on her. If Carolyn has a building and she sprinklers, and my building is next door full of hoarder junk and it's not sprinklered and it goes up in flames, her building might not burn down, but it's not going to be, I mean, she might lose a wall still. Sprinklering every one building as they become renovated is not a great strategy. So figuring out ways to work with it. We also have hired preservation architects to work in some of these cases where the building inspector has essentially told the property owner, yeah, there's nothing you can do without, paying $180,000 to sprinkler your building. And it turns out that if you use this exemption and you paint this color paint and you put this sort of door and this, that you can. You might not be able to do what you want to do, but you can do something which lets you generate some revenue until you can raise the money to, we want everybody to have sprinklers, but it's worse for a building to sit empty for 20 years because it has no sprinklers and no tenants than it is to try to find a use that can be economically, build a better education of inspectors. It's so challenging, but it's just not okay when a building inspector is like, yeah, I'm sorry, you can't use your building at all. That's really tough.
What is the sort of most frequent issue that you deal with and help business owners and then they're able to overcome the challenge? Is it code related, or is it more the market, understanding the market of their community?
I think, to be honest, it is perception. So we have so many building owners that have heard horror stories, and they are afraid that if they, or they assume that if they renovate their second floor, they need to add an elevator. But they don't, but they have heard this from somebody. And so they just take it to heart and like, well, we can't use that. And there have been building inspectors. I don't know if Watertown had a building inspector for 30 years that would not issue a certificate of occupancy for an upper floor project. They had 56 vacant upper floors. So it has been a real thing. And then it lives on in perpetuity. So a lot of it is just fear and unknown. And so if you can explain to them like, well, if you want to make it apartment, if you want to make it an Airbnb, yes, you need a sprinkler. If you just want to use it for your, business for an additional meeting room, then you can use it. And they're like, oh, we can use it. But they didn't know, and they're afraid to ask because then they might discover something else is wrong.
Right.
And that's, it's scary.
Challenge of the older buildings, right? So if you have a question, please type it in the chat for Errin. I think this has been fascinating. It's been a great breadth of information, especially I think the funding aspect. So is there a set number of grants that WEDC gives out, let's say for the vibrant placemaking? I mean, do you have a set pot of money and then you distribute it? How do you evaluate that so people know how to best apply?
So for the CDI grant, for all of them, we do have a pot of money. And essentially CDI is first come, first serve. And so is our idle sites. At this point, the vibrant spaces, we're doing a competitive round this first time because we knew we were going to have a lot of interest. So that was a competitive round. So we'll be comparing, and depending on how much those 60 to 70 projects ask for, we'll be able to fund a third, maybe a little more than that, and hopefully bring it back again in the future. We do know from our makeover program that we do at Main Street that the fact that people put things down in writing and have to identify the vision and get a resolution of support makes it more likely that they'll do something anyway. So we're hoping to really, yes, we'll be able to fund, 25, 30, 40 of them, but also we're hoping that lots of other spaces become vibrant because, we kind of incentivize people to do so. Do CDI public spaces qualify for CDR grants? It depends. They're the CDI grants, the traditional ones, not the new vibrant spaces ones, do require a commercial component. So if there is a brewery that has a patio, like in Lake Mills, then that a space could qualify, and that's a private space. But if you had a public space adjacent, that could potentially qualify as well. So it does have to have a commercial component, and it's not primarily based on gathering spaces, but depending on your project, it could qualify.
So I guess one follow-up question regarding sort of your parklets, things like that. Have you noticed the impact from the pandemic? And then is there consistency on communities saying, oh, we tried it out? Like I was thinking of the tactical urbanism. We've tried that in a lot of different communities where we tried out. Is that becoming more acceptable since the pandemic? And what's your experience with both tactical urbanism and things like the outdoor seating that maybe they expanded with the pandemic?
The outdoor seating and outdoor kind of space stuff has definitely become more acceptable, unless you're the DOT, in which case it has not been. Not to pick on them because I have told them this. It has definitely become more acceptable. There are still some places where concerns about parking will trump all other things. And certainly we've seen restaurants who used to have parklets who have discontinued them because they don't have the staffing to staff that many more tables. They can't even staff the tables in their building. So that has put a damper in some of those. But generally speaking, consumer wise, it's still, as popular, if not more popular than it was. And more municipalities are trying to find ways to accommodate them, again, if they're not on a state highway and the sidewalks are wide enough.
Okay, all right. So maybe one final question. So all these ideas are great, and as city starts filling all their vacant storefronts, and that starts to create a parking challenge, right, for both the businesses, the employees, and the surrounding residents. I guess, what are your suggestions for top strategies for some of the smaller communities to embrace?
So every community that we've ever worked with has a perceived parking problem somewhere. We do customer surveys in almost all of our communities, and the only demographic group that has ever responded to those surveys indicating that parking has been a deterrent from them coming downtown are those ages 65 and older. And so the issue is not parking, the issue is mobility and not having benches or places to rest or clearing our sidewalks of ice. So it's really things that are more of the ability to experience it safely, or ability to not parallel park. Some of those people are not big fans of parallel parking. So it's really more of a use case than it is a parking case. But certainly parking signage and, you know, convincing business owners to not park in front of their businesses and some of those basic management principles. We went down a rabbit hole of, now that there are more apartments and Airbnbs and things upstairs, there are some communities where to get a guest parking permit for overnight parking on the street, you need to go to the police office. And it turns out that 22-year-olds do not want to tell the chief of police that they have a sleepover guest that night. So just making online parking permits available that you could just buy them online and put them in your window, that is hugely impactful. So sometimes it's just a customer service thing that significantly improves enforcement.
Understanding who's there. Yes, it's one of those challenges, right? You want businesses to fill your vacancies, but then you have to deal with the other challenges that comes with it. So I really appreciate your expertise and sharing some time with us today. For those of you still online, we have a survey for you to fill out. And also want to just remind you that our next Innovative Cities lecture is going to be February 28th. And we're going to have a panel of 4 people from across the country talking about placemaking. So we'll have someone from Milwaukee, actually Gabriel Yeager, he'll be facilitating the discussion with the panel. And then we'll have experts who are involved with downtown placemaking in San Antonio, Minneapolis, and New York City. And they're all going to share some of their experiences and strategies for creating great places. As we know, as we just heard, that increases economic development in your communities. So we're excited for that next presentation. So do watch your email. For those of you, I know I'm getting requests for, they want your slides, Errin. They want all the information. So it'll be part of the recording. And so Jenny will be sharing that link out for all of you who have registered. So thank you again, Errin. It's really been really informational. And wish everybody good luck in their communities. And we will see you at the end of the month. Have a good week.
Oh.
Thanks.